The Beverly Council on Aging welcomes you to our program, Livin' the Good Life, designed to explore our beautiful city and the world around us.
Hello, and welcome to Livin' the Good Life. My name is Louise Fennell, and today I'll be talking to Doug Stewart, a man who recently wrote a very interesting book called The Boy Who Would Be Shakespeare. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Doug.
Well, I live in Ipswich, and I've been a freelance writer for about 25 or 30 years, mostly writing for magazines like Smithsonian. And this is my first book, and it's a true story, not a novel.
And how did you get this idea? Where did you hear about it?
Well, it's a story of a 19-year-old boy in England 200 years ago who claimed to have discovered Shakespeare's personal papers in an old trunk by accident. And in fact, he'd forged them all himself, including an entire play in Shakespeare's handwriting. And he did it in order to impress his father, who was a collector of Shakespeare memorabilia. And instead, it created a literary sensation in London because people thought at last they were seeing Shakespeare's personal papers, which no one had ever seen before.
And how did he do this convincingly enough for people at that time to believe it?
Well, it was 200 years ago. This is 1790, so shortly after the American Revolution. And people didn't really know that much about Shakespeare and what Shakespeare had written. First of all, no one had seen his papers, so nobody knew what Shakespeare's handwriting looked like. So when they looked at the papers, they didn't really know what to compare it to. And also what people knew of Shakespeare, and what Shakespeare at this point was being taught in school. Every schoolboy and schoolgirl knew the plays and the poems, but they were seeing drastically rewritten versions of Shakespeare. So people didn't really know what Shakespeare had written. King Lear was routinely presented as having a happy ending, which is kind of ridiculous. And also there were old papers and old-fashioned handwriting. And so they were very hard to decipher. But the boy used really old paper, so it looked old. So a lot of people just thought, looks good to me.
And how did he get that old paper?
Well, I should start out by saying a little bit about the context of what was going on. When Shakespeare was, he was writing in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And at the time, he was just a middle-class writer, writing for a slightly disreputable business, which was the public theater. And people in those days didn't consider what playwrights did as literature, and they didn't consider the manuscripts to be worth saving. So nobody saved these things, very rarely. The only memorabilia you'd keep would be things that belonged to a saint or to a monarch. So the stuff had disappeared, had been thrown out. So when the boy decided to impress his father by claiming he discovered Shakespeare's personal papers, which is what the father had been looking for most of his life, he used old parchment rolls. He worked in a lawyer's office and was by himself a lot. So there was lots of old parchment. He had specially made ink that was watered down to look faint. And since nobody knew Shakespeare's handwriting, he just wrote in a style that had been popular with scribes in the 16th century. So it looked pretty good.
And he knew enough about the language to be able to...
Well, that's the trick. I mean, people say, on the one hand, this is the most implausible, story you can imagine, where you have a teenage boy writing like Shakespeare. How could he possibly do it? But in fact, kids were studying Shakespeare in school. They were memorizing long passages. By the late 1700s, Shakespeare was the most popular playwright in London. His plays were being performed constantly. So everybody knew the sound of Shakespeare's words, and they knew the plots.
Okay.
So when he wrote a play, it was a pastiche. He took, bits of Macbeth, bits of Hamlet, bits of As You Like It, and he sort of worked it together. And if people had been a little more astute, they would have, in reading the play, they would have thought, boy, this sounds familiar. This sounds like it was cribbed from Hamlet. And instead they thought, this reminds me of Hamlet. It must be Shakespeare.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard too, I took some Shakespeare courses in college, and I heard that there was some question of Shakespeare having copied, I think it was Marlowe or a few other people.
Sure.
So did that fit in with his trying to do this?
Well, not so much. Where that fits in is the fact that originality in Shakespeare's day was meaningless.
Okay.
There was a King Lear, I think, published 10 years before Shakespeare's King Lear. So you would just take what you wanted and use it. In some cases, Shakespeare might have acted in plays and then wrote plays based on, the roles he remembered performing. But I think what's more important is that people really didn't care about what was authentic or what wasn't until the late 1700s.
Okay.
Shakespeare himself, when he died, had been forgotten, or soon was forgotten. His plays weren't performed in the 1600s very often. He wasn't considered a genius. He used puns, lots of sexual innuendo, ghosts and witches. Those were considered unseemly for serious tragedies.
Okay.
Which is one reason he was rewritten, and also one reason why he wasn't popular with lots of people. But then he was rediscovered, really, or revived in the 1700s, in the mid-1700s, because at that point literacy was growing. In Shakespeare's time, people were illiterate. The only way to know Shakespeare was to go to the Globe or other theater and see the plays. But now they were being printed and printed in huge numbers. And the British Empire was growing, and they needed proof that there was no genius like English genius, and especially that English genius was superior to French genius. And Shakespeare was exhibit number one. So now they were performing the plays, and they needed to find relics from his lifetime. Because Shakespeare, from being a middle-class man, was now a god. And if you're a god, you've got to have relics that can be worshipped. So where were they? And even in his birthplace in Stratford, there's furniture, but none of it is Shakespeare's. It was all added later.
Yeah, I've been there, actually, and I believed it all.
Well, it's not a lie, but they collected a lot of that in the late 1700s and early 1800s.
Okay.
Just to make it look good.
Yeah, and what attracted you to this topic in particular?
Well, I guess I've always liked stories of scams, victimless crimes. This wasn't technically a crime because the boy didn't profit from it. But it's sort of something about the comeuppance of intellectuals is, I think, enjoyable to a lot of people. Because the people who believed the papers were genuine, I mean, the boy didn't set out to create a huge sensation and to humiliate British society, which he did. He started out really just as a prank, either to impress his father, or a part of him may have wanted to put one over on his father, because they had a very complicated relationship. And they're the two main characters, the boy and his father, in the book. The father was a very pompous, self-assured, egotistical man who, as I said, collected all kinds of memorabilia, not just Shakespeare's, but from royal families and so on. And their townhouse in London was like a museum.
Yeah, I read the book.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. I congratulate you on
thank
it.
you.
But I didn't like his father very much.
And the father thought his son was a dunce. The boy had failed at about 3 different schools. Nobody was impressed by him. But what they didn't recognize is he didn't like school. He didn't like his teachers. And he didn't see the point in doing these lessons. So he kept getting kicked out of school. And his father would belittle him and say, you know, why can't you be like thus and such a writer or something? And there has to have been a certain amount of resentment, but the boy couldn't come out and be openly rebellious because that really wasn't done in Georgian England.
Oh, okay.
You'd be disowned. So I think part of it was this was a way to get back at his father. He wasn't going to succeed at impressing his father by writing like Shakespeare, even though the father thought the writing was Shakespeare's. Because at what point, if you're a forger, do you come forward and say, you know that stuff I showed you that was so brilliant? I wrote it. You're not going to make the person delighted. You're going to make them furious.
Sure.
So he had painted himself into a corner.
Ah.
And then other people started saying, oh, they made pilgrimages to the house to see the papers, and James Boswell kissed the play manuscript and said, I shall now die contented. And the poet laureate wept when he read the play or the first page. He wept to say, oh, I know I'll never be as great a poet as Shakespeare that I'm seeing here. And the Prince of Wales, or not the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Clarence, who was later King William IV, ordered 7 copies of reproductions of the papers. So it was a huge deal. And it was, and then the play itself was scheduled to be performed in the biggest theater in London with the greatest actors and actresses of a generation. So instead of trying to pull back and stop what he was doing, the boy, it went to his head, and he started to think, I must be a second Shakespeare. Everyone's praising me. So he wrote another play. And he wrote more things. He wrote love letters from Shakespeare to his wife. And he wrote little things, receipts and memos and other letters, letters to the Queen Elizabeth.
Wow. And how did you find out all this?
Well, it's actually been published since that time in England. It's not known here. But it's sort of, it went into, the whole story has been forgotten in part because people later writing about it wrote as though the boy was a fool, the forgeries were terrible, and nobody serious was taken in by it. Well, that's just not true. That's people later trying to sanitize history.
Yeah, but where did you get? Did you go to England?
Well, I went to England, and you can read these things online. His own, his father's books even are completely online. And I first heard about it when I was doing a story about who really wrote Shakespeare for Smithsonian Magazine. Because there's a controversy since there's no papers, no furniture, no clothing.
Yes.
Not even a description of what he looked like. There's no painting or drawing made from his lifetime. A lot of people have doubts and say, did Will of Stratford really write these plays? A boy with a grammar school education?
Actually, I'm fascinated by that because I took a whole Shakespeare seminar and a whole course. And that was one of the things that came up a lot. Did Shakespeare really write all of Shakespeare?
Well, I spent several months researching this for this article, and I tried to talk to everybody I could who doubted that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, and I never found a single tenured professor who would give it any credence. There are thousands of people who believe it, but they tend to be not scholars of the English Renaissance.
Oh, okay.
There are people that are saying, why were there no letters? Well, middle-class people in Shakespeare's times didn't write letters. Paper was handmade, usually in France. It was very expensive. And the idea of keeping diaries, like Samuel Pepys, that was 100 years later, 80 years later. And even Pepys was one of the first. And also in grammar school, you studied, Latin and Greek.
Right,
And when they say, well, how could Shakespeare have set plays in Italy? He never left England. Well, he set plays in ancient Rome, and he never lived in ancient Rome. And neither did anyone else who wrote about ancient Rome.
Sure.
So really what it comes down to isn't that there's a problem with the historical Shakespeare, I don't think. I think the problem is that people are dying to know who Shakespeare was. And it torments the people who love Shakespeare's plays and poems to feel that he's so distant and unreachable that we'll never know the man behind Ophelia
Yeah.
you know, and Lady Macbeth and all these other characters. You wonder,
Right.
what was he like?
Mm-hmm.
You know, was he
Exactly.
popular? Did he have a sense of humor? Did he love his wife?
Uh-huh.
And one thing that I realized when I was reading about this is that this boy, in this case, actually satisfied some of that urge to know Shakespeare by filling in gaps in Shakespeare's biography.
Uh-huh.
By, for example, writing a love letter to his wife before they were married.
Mm-hmm.
And people read that, instead of thinking, I don't believe it, this kid saying he found this. Instead, they're going, well, finally, we've been looking for these papers. We knew they weren't really thrown away. And now, here's evidence he did love his wife. He was a nice guy.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, there's no evidence of that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
sure.
she lived in Stratford, he lived in London.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a little funny if he really loved her so much.
He left her his second best bed in his will. Some people try to say, well, that would have been a very good bed, but
sure.
you know, it doesn't sound like a wonderful love story.
Yeah. And I know, I read, it was probably in your references in the back or something, that you did a lot of research at Harvard.
Well, yes. In the Rare Books Library, they have a huge archive of material related to these forgeries, including what may well be one of the original deeds that William Henry forged. It's a little hard to know because after the scandal blew over, the play was performed once, and people didn't know what to make of it, but the skeptics were always there, and they kind of won out. But after that, he was reduced, William Henry Ireland is the boy's name, he was reduced to making forgeries of his forgeries. Because people would come to their house and say, gee, do you still have that love letter to Anne Hathaway? And he'd say, I'm guessing, he would say, well, no, not right now, come back in a week. And a week later, he'd sell them a copy because he was sort of cranking the stuff out. So either the original of one of the deeds that William Henry forged or the original itself is at the Rare Books Library at Harvard. And it certainly looks 400 years old. You know.
Okay. Can anyone get access to
I
these?
believe so.
Really?
It used to be any Massachusetts resident could go in, but they watch you very carefully.
Okay.
And now I think you have to fill out a lot of forms and maybe justify why you want to see it.
Okay.
It's very hard to read. You know, the handwriting is tough to make out.
Yeah.
But still. And then later the boy wrote his own confession, which was not a confession, it was more like a proclamation, like, I wrote this great stuff. And his father didn't even, not only didn't believe the confession, he didn't believe the boy was smart enough to have written the confession himself. Yeah, and he died 4 years later still thinking the papers were authentic.
Really?
Yeah, but then in time people wrote about this as well. We all knew the stuff was fake.
And what happened to the boy in later life?
Well, he ended up being persona non grata in England. He didn't feel very comfortable being there, and he was also a budding romantic poet. This was the dawn of the Romantic era, and he didn't think much of the literary establishment anyway. He thought the real frauds were the people that attested to the fact that the papers were genuine. He said, they're the frauds. They say they're Shakespeare experts. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm not a fraud. But he ended up living in France a long time.
Okay.
As
a writer? Or?
As a writer, yep. And he came back to England and he wrote a bunch of books. He wrote Gothic novels, actually. And the interesting thing is, when he tried to write like Shakespeare, it really sounded like Shakespeare in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because he had a model he could imitate. When he was not constrained like that, he could write whatever he wanted, like very dramatic Gothic novels. They're terrible. They're just so overwritten.
Really?
They're kind of amusing. They're in print again.
They are?
Yeah, William Henry Ireland. There's about 3 of them you can get.
Yeah. Online or?
If you could, yeah. I don't really recommend it.
Okay. It's not worth the time, huh?
Well, it depends what you like. It's historically important because the Gothic novel was a new thing. And he was actually one of the early promoters of it. And then Napoleon gave him a medal at one point in Paris. And that was partly, I think, because for his good deed in making the English ruling class look bad.
Yeah, they would enjoy that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did you feel when you were writing this? Like, how did it compare to writing for a magazine?
Yeah. Well, it felt good because when you write for a magazine, you really have to pack a lot into a short space, and you leave out 90% of what you learn. I mean, I left out 90% of what I learned here too.
I'm sure.
But it was nice to be able to stretch and tell the story the way I wanted to, without having to squeeze it into 3,000 or 2,000 words.
Yeah. Okay.
And also, I just love writing about history. And I find it amusing. It's also fun to write about people who are long dead because you can hold up some of their foibles and not worry about getting sued for slander.
Oh, that's good.
Because there was a lot of foolishness. I mean, it's really unbelievable how much self-delusion there was. But it's because of wishful thinking. And it all comes down to people wanting to believe what they hoped was true.
Oh, sure.
Without evidence.
Sure. Yeah. How much did you have to just sort of fabricate as far as...
Oh, I didn't.
I don't mean the facts. I mean, like, certainly you weren't there for some of the scenes or, you know, interactions with his father or that kind of thing.
Right. I think what I did is I tried to... you know, conjecture what had happened in certain cases or what he was thinking. But when I did that in the book, I tried to make that clear, like he must have done this or he might have done that. And certainly there's a tradition when it comes to writing Shakespeare biographies, I should say as an aside. Every sentence in Shakespeare's biography says must have, would have, surely knew about. And the New York Times reviewing one Shakespeare biography recently said it was a bestseller by Stephen Greenblatt, said it was really good, but maybe this should be on the fiction bestseller list, not the nonfiction bestseller list, because there's so much of that. And I didn't do so much. I mean, most of this is based on sources you have, things people have written, things other, both what the boy and his father wrote and what other people wrote about them and about the time. And when I'm trying to figure out his relationship with his father, you know, if I'm sort of not totally sure, I would try to say that rather than just totally present it as historic fact. But in the case of many of the supporters of the papers who believed it was Shakespeare, they were publishing page-one stories in British newspapers. They were the editors of the newspapers. They were putting out proclamations and arguing publicly that this was definitely Shakespeare. And if you don't believe it, you're an ignoramus, as one editor said in London. Who then took it back a year later.
Sure. Yeah. So, wow. So are you thinking about another book?
I have several ideas, but nothing that I can talk about right now because, you know, it's a competitive business, so you have to sort of do your research first.
Sure.
But I like writing about history, and to me it's not hard to imagine about what people were like 200 years ago. This is the time when, right after the American Revolution, the time of the China trade, the time when, you know, Beverly was a bustling city, and we have plaques on all our houses here from much earlier. So the 1790s is sort of a familiar time. You know, in Ipswich, I walk down the street and there's more than 100 houses from that era and before. But I think some people, maybe younger people, can have a hard time having history come alive. And I guess I don't. I was born in Lexington. I was born in Lexington, Mass.
Wonderful.
You know, cradle of liberty. So the Battle of Lexington it's as though it happened yesterday in 1775. So that was already 20 years old when this story took place.
So you grew up interested in history.
Yeah, I think so.
That's great. Yeah. Now, was your magazine writing in this same sort of style?
Sometimes. I've written about lots of things. For Smithsonian, I wrote a lot of history stories. I wrote about Queen Elizabeth I. I wrote about Shakespeare. I wrote about ancient Pompeii and other things. But also more modern history, like I did a story on the World War II Jeep. that probably got more mail than anything I'd written. That or the Shakespeare, who wrote Shakespeare's story, together got so much mail, I couldn't believe it, with people taking sides or sharing their own stories in the case of the Jeep. But I also read about the arts, and I used to be a science writer.
Oh.
So lots of different
great.
things.
Now, how would I find your, I'd like to read some of these things.
Right. Well, first of all, you can get the book online at Amazon.
Well, this I've read.
Yeah.
I made sure I read that.
Yeah.
It sounded
but also
so
if people
good.
are interested, you know. And there's also, I should mention, a website, which is called fakeshakespeare.com.
Fakeshakespeare.com.
Right. And you can read an excerpt from the book. You can see short videos and photographs of paintings and scenes. But as far as articles I've written, I mean, magazines last longer than newspapers, but they don't last very long.
Okay.
So it's hard, but you can see back issues.
Okay.
But it's kind of hard to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm still doing other stories for...
Oh, good. So you're still writing for magazines?
Right. I actually have a story coming out next month in America's Civil War, of all things. I don't know if you really have time for this, but it's about my great-great-grandfather.
We still have 3 minutes or so.
Okay. This is an article about my great-great-grandfather, who I'd always heard was a newspaper editor in Pennsylvania who gave the Gettysburg Address a bad review and went to jail for it. So I Googled him a few months ago. So and it's true, he went to jail.
Really?
For treason. And I found an old daguerreotype of him and more material.
Yeah.
And I learned that the Civil War in Pennsylvania was very controversial. There were many people like my great-great-grandfather who thought Lincoln was a fool and an embarrassment to the United States.
Whoa.
But after he was assassinated and after the Union won the war, it became impossible to say that. And so he left town. He was in Harrisburg. He moved to Pittsburgh.
Okay.
So,
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So writing is in your genes.
I guess. Well, I don't write like him. He was an unbelievable racist, for one thing. As were many people in wartime Pennsylvania. It was a shock to me to see. So, and one thing that impressed me was that now we have an African-American president, which my great-great-grandfather could never have imagined, but also the tenor of public argument in the 1860s was so much worse than it is today. We've actually become more civilized, which is nice.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
You don't see all this sort of libelous racism right on page one like you did all the time in the 1860s.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow, yeah. So are you concentrating more on book writing than magazine writing, or trying to sort of
I can't
keep
really
the two?
say. I'm trying to keep the two going, but the problem with books, it's not a very healthy industry right now, because a lot of people are reading things online.
Yeah.
Or they're watching videos. And so readership of books is older than it used to be. So it's some question. And also so many books are sort of self-help books, not history books.
Yeah.
Unless you're a Pulitzer Prize winning professor of history.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm getting the nod
Okay.
that we need to wrap this up. Is there anything that you really want to get out to the public before we end it?
Well, I would just say again, go to fakeshakespeare.com if you want to know more. And there's really a lot you can read to see if you're interested in this story. I think it's unbelievable. And I had a lot of fun writing it.
Well, I had a lot of fun reading it.
Thanks.
And thank you so much. And I'm so glad that we could have this time today to do this too. And for the rest of the audience, I hope that you will take Doug's book and read it, because it really is fascinating. And thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
You've been watching Livin' the Good Life. We always welcome your comments and suggestions for future programs. Call us at 978-921-6017.